I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's webinar. My name is Rob Mayo and I'm the chair of the CILT Northern section. And with me tonight is my fellow committee members, George Weeks and Jan Shujiao. And it's our very great pleasure to bring you tonight's webinar, which is a very special topic. And I'd like to just get into that straight away. I've got a little bit of a preamble just to go through to prepare for what's going to be a very interesting discussion and presentation tonight. So as we all know, currently it's the New Zealand government's position that the Port of Auckland needs to move. 3 studies on the future of Auckland Port have been conducted in the last 4 years. The Port Future Study Report in 2016, the Upper North Island Supply Chain Strategy Report in 2019, and the Superior Report in 2020. All 3 reports have stated that there is significant environmental impact for expanding the port in its current location, and that in its current form, the Auckland port is no longer economically viable. The relocation of Auckland's port has been called New Zealand's most ambitious infrastructure project ever. But where should it be moved to and when is still up in the air. So what global shipping trends will influence New Zealand's import and export logistics infrastructure priorities? What are the economics of a port move? What is actually involved in moving a port? What impact does the location and the timing of a port move have? And should the Port of Auckland be moved at all? Tonight, we have 4 people who have been actively involved in the study of the Auckland port move and its effect on the region as a whole. Our first speaker tonight is Mick Pays. Originally from the UK, Mick is a former seafarer who served on the very first OCL container ships before settling in New Zealand in 1973. He worked for the Shipping Corporation of New Zealand and was CEO of NZL Group, a joint venture between the then New Zealand Dairy Cooperative and the Freightways Group. He ran a multitask freight logistics and port handling company that was subsequently sold to P&O Ports. Mick's been based in Sydney since 2001, working for P&O Ports Asia, overseeing their terminal operation development throughout the region, and then becoming a port development consultant, working with various agencies to develop container and bulk cargo business. Mick will be talking tonight on the impact of global shipping trends on New Zealand's port infrastructure and the aspects of operational resilience New Zealand ports need to factor into their future planning. Our second speaker is Mark Oxley. Mark's a naval architect, a former seafarer, and a long-time CILT New Zealand member. He's been a consultant in port and shipping-related planning for more than 30 years. Over that time, Mark has advised on the setting up of new ports in the Pacific Islands and on the development of bulk cargo port facilities in Australia's Northern Territory and in the Philippines. Mark's interest in the location of Auckland's port started back in 1985, when he was involved in the establishment of the Tasman Express line, which operated between New Zealand and Australia, calling it Onehunga on the Manukau Harbour as its Auckland port. The company's success was due in part to the competitive advantage of its west coast facing Auckland port. Mark will be talking to us tonight about the economics of ports. Our third speaker is Richard Rynan-Hamill. Richard is the Technical Director of Coastal Engineering at Tonkin & Taylor. Richard has more than 30 years experience in coastal and port engineering, coastal process and hazard assessments in the Pacific region and in Europe. He holds postgraduate qualifications in fluid mechanics, coastal processes and multi-hazard risk assessments. Prior to joining Tonkin & Taylor, Richard worked for the international hydraulic and coastal specialist consultants Delft Hydraulics in the Netherlands in their harbours and coasts division. His key skills are evaluating hydrodynamic and coastal processes, hazard assessment, and designing to take into account the natural process of harbours. Tonight, Richard will be telling us about what it takes to move and build a port. Our fourth and final speaker this evening is Greg McEwen. Greg is the former chair of Auckland City Council Transport Committee. He has a broad knowledge and strong interest in transport, port, city centre and citywide development issues. He has submitted on the Auckland Unitary Panel hearing processes at both regional policy statement and more detailed port precinct levels, advocating for a comprehensive, broad and independent analysis of long-term port development options. Greg will be talking to us tonight about the impact the location and the timing of the Auckland Port move will have on our city's future. At the conclusion of the fourth 10-minute presentation, each speaker gets 10 minutes in this case. From Greg, we will then move immediately into a panel discussion. During the presentations, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom link to send in your written questions to our 4-member panel. We won't be accepting oral questions tonight because from previous webinar experience, we have found that individual computer mics and internet connections can quite often produce unnecessary mic feedback or inaudible audio. So please do use the Q&A function to send in your questions. Please be aware too that there might not be sufficient time tonight for Mick, Mark, Richard and Greg to answer all of the questions submitted. If there are submitted questions which are similar in content, in the interests of time, only one of those questions will be put to the panel for answering. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mick Pays to deliver the first of our 4 10-minute presentations on the potential move of the Auckland Port. Mick, over to you.
Well, thanks, Rob. We'll now get into the presentation. It's lovely to join everybody in this New Zealand bubble, having been out of New Zealand for some time. I was there just as the door closed, so I'm looking forward to the door opening again so I can get back to see you all again. So, seeking shipping resilience, it's perhaps appropriate that I'm addressing you on this, being as I'm living across the ditch. And indeed, it's the externalities that, to some extent, that are driving the requirement for New Zealand to review its position as far as ports are concerned. So I'll be talking tonight about the various externalities. Why move a port? The ports themselves need the capacity to receive the next generation of container ships. These are changing dramatically in the last few years. These larger ships, much larger ships, require deeper and wider channels, often with a different geometry. Of course, being longer, they'll need longer and stronger key lines because their deadweight will have increased, so they have to be stronger to accept the pressures of such larger vessels when they berth. And on top of that, literally, heavier cranes are needed because there's much greater outreach required when you have a ship with a beam of 50 meters plus, as opposed to the earlier Panamax vessels, which were for up to about 32 meters. The outreach creates hell of an increase in pressure on that outer rail. And the terminal stack areas need the capacity to deliver the increased volumes because exchanges inevitably are much larger, and to feed the cranes that are necessary to get decent turnaround times, you've got to push a lot of containers through a small area of container terminal stack area. The transport systems, of course, are often in these ports a problem in themselves. The land side needs to be able to cope with increased volumes and peaks. And in many places, and I believe New Zealand is no different, the road exchange areas and systems are needed to be updated so that queuing can be avoided. If you double your throughput, you've got double the traffic coming through the same old roads. Rail exchange sidings have to be long enough as well for higher capacity, longer trains, unless you're going to accept the status quo remaining as is now. And if you keep the same status quo, you're going to have twice as many trains if your percentage of rail is the same. The external approach roads are also a major question if you double the traffic into the port. And the cities need to determine the potential for better alternative use of the land that the ports are on. Many ports have been shifted around the world as much as anything because the value of the land is such that it's better to use that for city development rather than the ports, and the ports are best moved somewhere else. So, and then at a higher level again, countries, in this case New Zealand, need to look at achieving lower costs for exporters and importers. Importers generally, the import organisations are price takers. They're not too concerned. Mark will talk about that as long as they're on an even footing with each other. But exporters need to compete. And overall, the government and both regional and local needs to look at better financial and economic viability. And of real importance, in my view, is this future proofing against risk. The seismic issues that you have in New Zealand, which we forecasted back in the 90s after the Kobe earthquake, were brought home to roost when Littleton and then Wellington have suffered badly. You need to have a strategy to have alternate operations available. And channel strandings, I'd stress, are very important too, having personally been operating a port that was substantially compromised by a ship sinking in the channel. So, and we need to move on. Why is that not going on? Okay, so the future ship supply and cargo demand. In most cases, it's often considered to be the cargo that drives the requirement for ships, but really we're now in a situation where the ship market has changed so much, we're having to try and fit the cargo flow into the ships that are available. So we've got to look at the container ship market. We've also got to look at the container service operators in the future, because there's a big change in the market, which I'll run over. And total transport economics need to be reviewed, because ship costs have been falling in terms of slot costs. So costs of importing and exporting have reduced. But if that's going to continue, we have to be able to handle the bigger vessels. We have to cope with hubbing increased costs and increased volumes, and be aware that landside costs are even more important if you shorten up the number of calls at ports on the coast of New Zealand. And then the last point here is the relationship between the Australian and New Zealand trades, which I'll cover in a moment. Then we have the future shipping service supply. If we look at recent analysis of ships that have been purchased, only 21% of the capacity of current ships under construction were under 10,000 TEU. Most are much larger. By the earliest time when a new port could be ready, there will be only few vessels left of the size that currently serves Australia and New Zealand. And this is, of course, because of the removal of the Panama or Panamax size constraint. And even less of these ships will have sufficient refrigerated capacity to serve the likes of the New Zealand trades. If we look at the order books, there's a number of features appear here. The various lines in this bar charts show the dark lines are the smaller vessels. The blue side is the 5,000 to 10,000 TEU, yellow is 10 to 15, and above that is red. And you'll see that the 10,000 TEU size was just about dead from 2016, really as a result of Panama closing. And then there's a bit of replenishment of smaller ships subsequently, but quite clearly the larger ships are becoming predominant, and the sizes that we think are economic for the ANZ trades are just not being built. So they, in 10 years' time to 20 years' time, there'll be none to cascade into our trades. Now let's look at the shipping lines. Just 3 or 4 years ago, there was about 15 or 16 major shipping lines, all largely operating independently or in limited cooperation with each other. And that's now reduced very substantially. Maersk and MSC work together with HMM, that's Hyundai. COSCO and CMA work closely together on the international trades, and the Japanese, ONE and Hapag-Lloyd, together with Yang Ming, are working closely together as well. Effectively, in the international circuits, there's just 3 shipping lines left to feed something like 80% of the world. So if you want to get your cargo anywhere, those 3 groupings are going to take your cargo to those destinations, except on smaller Pacific Island type trades. So those lines are going to be very influential in what they want and the size of ships they want to see coming to our Oceania area. So the shipping lines, what do they want? The port must enable the use of these larger cascaded vessels. It must have berthing on arrival. It must have enhanced, it must enable them to enhance their shipping schedules, provide integrated feeder services wherever they're linking to them, mainly in Asia. provide satisfactory crane intensity, which is all about making sure you can get 5 or 6 cranes into a ship, not just 1 or 2, and achieve a competitive ship exchange rate as well, and offer competitive terminal charges. So if you're upgrading, you've still got to try and keep to the same sort of charges as you've got now, or preferably even reduce them. And individual lines, of course, will always look for a competitive advantage against their other competitors in the market. So what's this volume of New Zealand trade? Of course, exports exports usually trail imports by a wee bit, because if there's a growth in the market, but that's not the real picture. The real picture is in terms of who wants what cargo, is which containers are full and what are they. If we look at the New Zealand import-export ratio, there's export volumes exceeding imports by around 30%. Although these volumes are very misleading, of course, the ratios significantly vary between container types, but nevertheless, it indicates the revenue that's available northbound out of New Zealand versus southbound. And the imbalance has always been there, right from the very start of container services, from the bay boats and the ACT ships, always was that imbalance from New Zealand attracting Australian crossover ships. And that is still the case now. For the last full year into Australia, only 57.6% of containers were full outbound against the full import boxes. So lines serving Australia are always going to look to come to New Zealand to grab a share of that imbalance that takes northbound over southbound. And here's a few examples. There's lots of crossover services already. That's just exactly what happens now. It's a combination of all sorts. The various lines show their route maps, and you can see there just a few of them, and that is likely to continue. And I suggest to you that with the bigger ships coming in, the challenge through the Australian ports will be to one, get those big ships into their ports, but secondly, in those reduced sailings, probably northbound from Melbourne, they would love to cross over to the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand to have a one port of call there, and then swing back to Brisbane as much as they do now to pick up empties and head north again. So the west coast is very attractive as far as that's concerned, just shorter distances. And just before I move on, I've talked a bit about resilience at the start. Just remember, when looking for a solution, there is that fault line running through the Firth of Thames, which is going to be a challenge for construction purposes and may put a facility at risk, unless a lot of consideration is given to the construction of the various infrastructure that's put in there. And likewise, in existing ports, be aware that your narrow channels and with longer ships are going to be, even if they're deepened, will have a risk of groundings, and these things do happen. I'm aware of a number of near misses in various ports of call, and I would say you've got to plan a strategy as a country to make sure you can cover a situation where you lose a port, and make sure you've got alternatives that are not going to suffer from the same incident, so that you can keep supply lines going. And with that, I'll end my bit of the externalities and pass it to Mark to talk about how that all affects New Zealand. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Mick. Thanks for handing that over. I'll just bring up my presentation. One moment. So I'm going to talk about the choice. I'm going to ask the question why and where, and then hand over to the others on how. first question is why. There's two reasons for it needing to move, usually. Either you reach a capacity constraint or it's beneficial to change. So on the first one, the capacity constraint, this can be caused by expansion limitations or access limitations both to the hinterland and to the sea. So on the first of those, the capacity limitations, the forecast container throughput that is in the SAPERI report, the drivers of throughputs, the drivers of the container throughput for imports, it's a function of the population growth and the New Zealand GDP growth, and for exports it's a function of the export destination's GDP. Import container growth outstrips GDP growth. The reason for this is as the GDP per capita increases, our capability to consume increases as we get wealthier, but domestic supply, that's the ability to manufacture, can't keep up. Our economy is really geared up to production for export, so we import more, and that increases the container per capita as we go into the future. And in SAPERI's report, they forecast a base case growth of 2.26%. They had a higher growth rate of 2.51, and they also put forward an official's growth rate of 0.75%. And this compares with the last 4 years where the growth in the Auckland and Port of Tauranga throughputs, the Upper North Island throughputs, was 4.8%. So operating capacity, you can see from this graph that operating capacity is reached in about 30 years' time. The purple line is the higher forecast that SAPERI analysed. The black line is their calibrated forecast, their base case, and the light blue line is the officials' agreed forecast. So operating capacity will get reached in about 30 years' time. However, it might be that it's beneficial to change. This could be because of the economics and social or cultural reasons, or because of environmental reasons. And the cost-benefit analysis that was carried out addresses all of these. The components of the economics are in capital expenditure, it's the port itself, the links to the hinterland, road and rail, and links to the sea, that's the channels. Operating costs, it's the terminal operations, inland transport costs, and sea voyage costs. And this latter one, sea voyage costs, that was overlooked by all of the recent studies, SAPERI, the Upper North Island strategy, and the Future Port study. We'll come back to that. And SAPERI's report also looked at the environmental and social benefits and costs, and they covered items such as congestion, emissions, safety, agglomeration, amenity, consumer and producer welfare, and taxation deadweight costs. And the biggest of these is the amenity costs. That's the benefit to Auckland of the land that's occupied by the port activities being returned to the city. So their analysis, they looked at they looked at the benefits and the costs, and then they looked at what the net benefit was. So in terms of total benefits, Northport and Tauranga had total benefits of, this is in present value and it's in millions of dollars. So this is nearly $1 billion net present value. And most of this, over $900 million, it was due to the amenity value of the port land returning to the city. The Firth of Thames option had the same 958,000 plus another 51,000, which was a reduction in congestion. The combined Northport and Tauranga option, of course, had the same 958. And the Manukau option had another $600 million advantage, and that was because of savings in inland transport costs, both road and rail. On the cost side, Northport had 7 billion present value of cost. That was a combination of capital costs and high operating costs because of the distance from the market. Tauranga didn't have much in the way of capital costs, but there was a fair bit of operating cost involvement there. Firth of Thames was a high total because of high capital costs, but only moderate operating costs because of the distance is a lot closer to Auckland than the other options. It's Northport and Tauranga combined. And Manukau had the lowest of the costs. It's nearly all capital costs. There's, in fact, for operating costs, it was benefits, which is in the blue bar above. So netting these off, Northport had 6 billion, Tauranga 3, Firth of Thames 7, the combined ports 6 again, and the Manukau round about 2. And putting this into benefit to cost ratio analysis, I've analysed this looking at the range of costs. The Sapere report put an accuracy range on the CapEx of plus or minus 50%. So I've applied that to the capital cost components. So the excuse me, the benefit to cost ratio for Northport and Tauranga was 0.13 and 0.21 respectively, and quite a narrow bandwidth there. So the red and orange bars are one standard deviation either side of the median, and the shaded area is going out to the 50 plus or minus 50%. The Firth of Thames also has a very low benefit to cost ratio, 0.12, but it has much higher capital costs, so it has quite a wider range, reaching up to 0.2 at the extreme best ratio. Northport and Tauranga combined are similar to their individual cases, and for the Manukau, the median value was 0.44, and because there's such a high capital cost component in here, then the probabilities are that it could be as high as about 0.9 or as low as about 0.3. So this is overwhelmingly in favour of the Manukau. But there's some adjustments required to this analysis. There's some benefits that have been missed. Shorter sea distances, as Mick was alluding to earlier, and also there's a change of port for cargoes, in at least in the case of the Manukau. So we'll look at those. Firstly, as well as that, there's some overstated costs, particularly in dredging costs, so we'll look at the implications of that. And the timing of change. Sapere's timing sensitivity analysis shows that there's improved net benefits for Manukau if the change were earlier, although this didn't apply to the other ports. So looking first at shorter sea distances, Mick put up this slide here. So just as an example, if there were to be services coming from Asia to Sydney and Melbourne, crossing over to New Zealand and then going back northbound through Brisbane, then to call it a West Coast port, the voyages are shorter by 200 nautical miles. And in order to give it some numbers to this, one way, at the very least, you could just make the ships go slower, so you get the same annual carrying capacity by going slower and saving fuel. And of course, a reduction in speed results in a reduction in fuel consumption on a third power relationship. So the fuel saving across a whole fleet would be about $53 million per annum. But further than this, on the New Zealand coast, we've got to get the cargoes not just to the northern North Island, we've got to get them to the whole country. And whether it's by the mainline ships carrying on to southern ports or whether it's by feeder services, it's still the same consequence. And we have here shorter round voyages. It's 450 nautical miles shorter from the Manukau to the southern ports and back than it is from Auckland to the southern ports and back. That is a day's steaming, and it allows a lower required speed of 25% slower. That results in a fuel saving across the fleet of $88 million per annum. Combining these, 88 and 55, is $142 million per annum saved, or in present value terms, if this were to start in 20 years' time, in 2040, it would be a present value of $666 million. The second thing that we need to adjust for is a change of port for cargoes. A Manukau port would allow, for New Zealand Steel, coal imports and steel imports direct to and from the mill rather than having to be railed across from Tauranga. The saving in rail freight, Mount Maunganui to Glenbrook, is about $16 million to $18 million a year, and this has a present value of $240 million. Similarly, fuel imports, the tank farm for Auckland is in Wiri, so direct imports through the Manukau could go straight to the tank farm. It's a shorter sea distance around South Australia than going around North Cape. This avoids the pipeline transport cost as well and provides Auckland with fuel and supply resilience. So there's more present value benefits there. So putting these onto the graph, over on the right-hand side, we've got Manukau as it was analysed by Sapere, and there were benefits of $1.5 billion, but with the additional $1 billion of benefit we've just talked about, this would rise to 2.5. The costs stay the same, $3.5 billion costs. So the net benefit improves from around about 2 billion to around about 1 billion. And looking at the benefit to cost ratio, earlier we had for Manukau a median value of 0.44. This now improves to 0.7, and the tail of the distribution reaches above 1, so that we've got a benefit, the potential for a benefit cost ratio of greater than 1. And dredging costs. In the Sapere analysis, it's got inconsistent estimates for dredging. The Manukau and the Firth of Thames, it used a rate of $60 per cubic metre, and it draws on the future port study from their CapEx estimates for this number. But for the ports of Auckland, Northport and Tauranga analyses, it used $15 per cubic metre. These were new estimates that were done for the study. A recent dredging estimates for Marsden Point have been carried out at a unit cost of $10 per cubic metre. So this suggests that the future port study estimates were greatly overstated. So adjusting from $60 to $15 per cubic metre for Manukau reduces port CapEx costs by $1.7 billion and its present value by $654 million. So now the benefit to cost ratio changes from 0.44 to 0.7 to 0.86, and you can see that it straddles the line of 1 inside 1 standard deviation. In fact, there's about a 40% probability that the benefit to cost ratio would be greater than 1. So it further increases the gap between the Manukau and the East Coast options. So the second of my questions was where. The choice seems clear-cut. The economic and social case is compelling. Manukau is the front runner, and on this basis, there would need to be an extremely strong reason to not move to Manukau. What remains is how. Richard will talk about engineering issues, the port entrance, channels, navigation and reclamation, and Greg will comment on port locations and links with the hinterland. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you for that. I'll just get my screen started and share. So I'm going to be talking about the coastal process kind of matters affecting port sightings. And I guess going over some of the things that Mark talked about, the existing port wasn't viable after some 30 years without some significant reclamation being carried out within the Port of Auckland and typically Mechanics Bay and heading eastwards. So they identified 5 other new ports sites, the Northport expansion, the Port of Tauranga, and an increased capacity at Northport, Port of Tauranga, and 2 new greenfield sites at the Firth of Thames and on the Manukau Harbour. These are just some images of the indicative size and scale of the Northport and the Tauranga changes. They are large reclamations providing the wharfage and the space required. All have complex issues in terms of coastal processes. Certainly my experience with refining New Zealand and getting the channel deepening consented suggests to me that there's some significant challenges both ecologically and coastal process wise and environmentally and culturally for say the Northport site taking out a significant pippy bank. But even these designs or scales would only provide some capacity for another 60 years. So the Superior report identified that in terms of the gateway test or the development that could provide resilience to the port infrastructure and for the future of Auckland and the North Island, these were the only 2 options that met those gateway tests. And what we have on the left-hand side is a schematic of the Firth of Thames showing 3 possible sites. So moving from Kawakawa Bay to the north, sort of Ariri Point, and down to Waimano Point at the south, and the little black line so showing the indicative track heading to South Auckland, and there's a little port infrastructure sort of diagram at the bottom. 3 sites were also considered for within the Manukau. One was close to the harbour entrance, which that central Manukau site sitting on the left-hand side of the image, and 2 other sites heading south of the airport along that main channel. And the one circled in red was sort of the, I guess, the more favourable in terms of reduced causeway and access across the port, because obviously trying to get, you need to get some significant causeways as you move out, say, to that central Manukau harbour option. These ports are designed as effectively salient or islands structures, as that little schematic shows at the bottom of the screen, which is a piled or sheet piled or retaining structure with sand infill, and then the wharves and structures built around the outside. Now, to be clear, the Manukau Harbour entrance is a significant challenge for this option, and there are very limited investigations and studies done to a scale that provides good understanding. Both, I mean, the Superior report includes some more recent high-level estimates and modelling to support some of the work that was done with the Port Future study, but still only a very first-order kind of assessment. So I just want to take you through some of the key identifiers, I guess, and based on some papers by Professor Ford and Dixon from the University of Auckland. This is a Landsat image showing the ebb tide delta, the channel and the inner reaches of the Manukau Harbour, and some broad depth indicators from the hydrographic charts. The Manukau's a large area. It's got a 3.4 metre tidal range and quite a deep inlet throat of 24 metres, and a tidal prism. And what that is the amount of water that flows every tide into and out of the harbour of some 918 million cubic metres. On the ebb tide delta, which is the seaward bar that at the entrance to the harbour, they estimated some 1,250 million cubic metres of sand, so a lot of sand sitting in that system. And it's a sandy coast, which is generally sort of gently sloping, that extends and shallow for quite a distance, with some 300, 400,000 cubic metres of sand moving along the coast. It's relatively high energy offshore on the west coast, with a mean wave height of about 2 metres and 11 to 13 second periods. So this hydrographic chart just gives us that information in a little more detail. What that shows is the various banks are moving from seaward to landward. We've got the ebb tide shoal with a number of banks and channels that run along. We've got the southern channel, which is a flood tide. So as the water comes into and out of the harbour, it actually moves in quite a complicated way. So even as water's going out on the turn of the tide, you have water coming into the harbour as well as water trying to come out. And that's why we have this quite complex configuration on the seaward side and a long, narrow throat, which extending through to Cornwallis before it fans out to the various banks and shoals to the east. But the general characteristics is because of those large flows coming into and out of harbour, and because of the relatively narrow confines between the Waitakere Ranges and Ngāwhiri Peninsula, we've got a fairly deep channel. And when we look at historic changes that have occurred, and this is looking at hydrographic charts and maps from 1863 to the present, what we see is those key features of a fairly deep throat, a large ebb delta, and migrating shoals seem to be really reasonably consistent, but there's a fair degree of movement of the channel over that time period. There's been more analysis, again by Ford and Dixon from 2000 to 2016, showing using the Landsat imagery to try and understand some of these dynamics. And again, we can see from this series of photographs that show the average movement from 2000 to 2002 versus 2014 to 2016. There's some quite significant changes. There's an increasing of that southern channel. There's a migration northward of the tidal inlet. So a dynamic system. So one of the factors that would need to be considered with a Manukau harbour option is how to keep the channel open, and the likelihood that this would require large-scale works and ongoing maintenance. So this was identified back in the Port Future study, and Black Key has identified that there was more studies and research needed to explore how the bar operated and the effectiveness and effective management options that was done, or would need to be done. It's likely because of the wave climate and the high energy and the requirement for ship safety that a reasonably deep channel would be required and reasonably wide. And the works, because of the tidal flows and the sediment transport that moves in and out and along the shoreline, some kind of management to keep the channel open and fixed at a location. These kind of things could include training works or maintenance, dredging and sand bypassing. And there's other innovative solutions like fluidization to keep or use the flows to manage the channel at a particular location. But all of these studies haven't been done yet to a scale to augment, I guess, the land-based studies that have been done over the last 4 years. And when we look at how the Manukau entrance compares with other ports around the world, this table, which we've got from ECOAST, that was one of the contributors to the Superior report in 2020, shows a range of key characteristics on port entrances, along with the tidal prism, so how much flow is going in and out, the spring tide range, which is how high the water moves over the spring tide from high to low, and the wave climate, and also where we've got that available, the dredging volume estimates that are published, and also the alongshore transport rates. So what we can see from the Manukau, it's a highly energetic, a large tidal spring. We look at San Francisco, which has got twice the flow coming in and out of the harbour each tide over a relatively small tidal range, and that's a combination of just a much larger bay within the San Francisco harbour to allow that water to flow, to provide that volume and capacity. It's got a moderate to high energy. Dredge volumes vary within the bar of some 300,000 on average, but varies from 80 to 800,000, so quite a significant change. And the alongshore drift volumes, when you compare that to the Manukau, is slightly lower, so 80 to 200,000. So as you go through and look at these other ports, I guess a key characteristic is that they're all quite different, and they all behave, the amount of dredging necessarily doesn't perfectly correlate to any of the factors of tidal range and prism, so they are all complex, and each one has a particular setting and a reason why dredging is the volume, that scale of dredging is done for that particular port. The bottom two, I guess, are New Zealand equivalents, Port of Otago and Port of Tauranga. They're interesting in terms of the scale. They've still an order of magnitude smaller in terms of prism, but sort of moderate to wave climates and tide range. But those dredging volumes, again, from that 60 to 250,000 cubic metre range, with reasonably sandy shorelines offshore and fairly large alongshore transport rates. I guess once you've addressed the issue of how to get into the harbour and through the bar, the coastal process issues and changes because of those deep channels that we saw in the hydrographic chart and effectively wind generated wave climate rather than significant swells because of that narrow throat. Other issues are likely to dominate more than the coastal process issues in terms of the physical processes. And within the Manukau, that's the airport, and this little plot here shows some of the considerations of height along the flight path that would need to be thought about in terms of cranes and decks and the like to manage the safe aviation. We've got ecology, unitary plan designations and the like. So certainly it was identified as all of the port proposals, all the new ports have significant consenting challenges. So there's no necessarily huge differentiator. They're all quite challenging. When we look at the Firth of Thames site, and this just shows again the hydrographic chart, we've got a slightly rockier coast, less sediment in the system, deep water closer to the shore. So in terms of the marine side, from a coastal process perspective, it's an easier design, but there's complex landslide issues of getting a road and rail connection through to South Auckland, and similarly complex in terms of this Hauraki Gulf Act and the coast and the environmental and statutory issues within this local area. So that really takes you through a trot through the coastal process issues and concerns of how you deal with a new port in the Manukau and the Firth. I'll now let Greg take over and close the show.
Well, thank you, Richard, and good evening, everyone. I'll just make one small adjustment here. So the topic I was given was location, 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 and I immediately thought of first Kirsty and Phil.
Tonight, it's our final battle of the series, which brings us to the question. Will you love it? Or will you list it?
So I suppose for their clients, you know, the plan is for a lot of growth, and the house is getting a bit small, and they've got a few problems with their neighbours in the central city. They've got to make up their minds. Will they, or we might as Aucklanders, will they stay, or will they shift to where they're closer to their work, or will they move out into the country or move to another town? So don't promise to answer those questions, but I do promise to leave you with what I think is the logical next step for Auckland. So we all want a cost-effective, productive supply chain. In fact, one that's even more cost-effective than the one we've got now. We've got to provide for big transport and for freight. And through all the reports, there is a dialogue about reducing the friction on road between freight and urban communities. And I just want to pick up the topic of reducing friction with the rail as well. We've got a growing and vibrant city centre, and much has been said about that. The port's already given up a lot of land, Wynyard Quarter and so forth, for city development. But really what that is pointed to is just city growth and how they grow. But it's not just about the city centre, it's the port operations extend beyond its boundaries much further than that and across the region. And, you know, we have invested, and some of the numbers Mark was talking about were big, $6 billion on rail-based transit. And if we've done that already with the CRL at $4 billion and other investments approaching too, then you have to ask the question, what's the return that Auckland is looking for out of such a big investment in rail-based transit? And it has to come through the development of town centres around all the rail. So here's a picture of New Lynn, and it's already grown. There's a couple of higher level apartment buildings there already, but more will follow. $300 million alone was spent on this transit orientated development. And it seems illogical to me that routing export, import and empty containers through transit orientated developments will work. It'll have a huge negative impact on these areas where you're looking to have high intensity and high amenity that'll attract people to want to live in them. So here we're looking at all the stations, 30 or 40 of them sitting on the map there, and I've put on two bits of two freight services so far. The freight coming in and out of the Tauranga port into Southdown to the Metro port, and of course the same area is the exit point and entry point for a lot of domestic freight. But if we have a look at the port, the Auckland port, if you're going to grow the Auckland port and grow the amount the rail is used, as you grow from 1 million to 1.5 million to 2 million to 2.5 million containers, and from 10 to 15 to 30% of those containers by rail, then clearly that's going to have a huge negative impact on Glen Innes and Panmure and Sylvia Park. And I suggest that that decision is diopposed to the earlier one I just mentioned, which is to build great town centres here that actually attract people. And it's easy for those of us who don't live next to those rail lines to think that it's not significant, but thousands of extra containers passing your place surely would be significant. And if we have a look at Northport just for a second, you know, the Northport option does provide a lot more jobs for Northland and would provide a lot more jobs for West Auckland, and time's too short tonight to address what the value of all those jobs are, and possibly some freight advantages around West and North Auckland. But there are capacity problems at Northport, a huge distance for imports into Auckland and exports out of the Waikato. The Northport report underestimated the cost of the Swanson-Avondale Southdown line, and I'd suggest to you that that is an impractical line for the same reason that to be passing freight through Henderson and New Lynn and you know, Papatoe and all these centres, which should be becoming major centres of increasing amenity and attractiveness to people, is counterintuitive. And as Mark mentioned earlier on, the overall economics of the Northport option didn't prevail in terms of a study. So, you know, Northport will have a role, won't it, in the future, but perhaps not the one that was foreshadowed by the Unisys report. And if we just look at what would happen, the favoured option on the Manukau, what would happen to the impact on those rail lines if a port was built at Puanui. And basically you would have exports coming from the south into Puanui directly by rail and going no further, leaving the rest of the lines for urban development. And of course, Puanui is so close to the freight hub of Auckland, the Manukau region, that the imports would come in by road off that port. So 2016 was a watershed year, really. I think in terms of the work that was done by the Port Future Study. Firstly, there was a diverse consensus working group that worked around the table for 14, 15 months. And it was a very challenging environment to work in, with some people advocating very strongly for the port, others advocating strongly for urban development, and importantly, 5 iwi representatives at the table. And if I could just speak to that, that aspect for a moment, they made a tremendous contribution, the iwi people, to that process. And I think that the engagement of iwi at the start of all our future studies to do with the port should be at the top, at the highest level, at the earliest possible time, rather than some time down the track. The other great thing about that study was we had, for the first time in my involvement since about 2001, an independent port planner. And that was great because we had in the room at last somebody that could provide some challenging input into the capacities of the port. And we did end up with one port representative agreeing that at some point Auckland would need a future port, and saying, I'll carry on running the current port, you guys look for the alternative. And that is the way it should be. You know, the port should be running itself efficiently, and it's up to Auckland and the people who govern us to be looking for the alternative site. So that study, the Port Future Study, started with an investment logic map, and we spoke about 3 things that really identify 3 problems. One, that capacity will constrain the port and limit economic growth in the long term. 2, that there's a tension between the competition for limited resources in the CBD by the city centre and the port, and that will lead to a suboptimal outcomes for one or both of them. And thirdly, that if we're going to expand ports, any port, then we just have to understand all the impacts and address them. And the solution that the Port Future Study came up with was that we had to establish a new port location, and that location should be at the Firth of Thames or Manukau. And Sapere have really endorsed the Manukau as the leading option, and Mark has laid out some good reasons why it is a most favourable option to look at. The Port Future Study also talked about there needing to be 2 triggers that might trigger when you build a new port or start thinking about a new port, in 3 scenarios. One is when the city centre or Auckland or New Zealand say that there's more benefits to doing it, and you pull the city centre trigger. The other is the freight capacity of the port, you could pull that trigger. Or there might be some other reason, or for some future change in circumstances, 20 years of COVID or whatever, that you might never pull that trigger. And of course, that's most unlikely because of the growth rates that we'll have in freight. So to talk to the Thames option quickly, the first person I'm aware of that provided any detailed study was a planner and architect, Martin Evans, who really came up with this diagram. It's Martin's diagram, and I thank him for it, where he located his favoured place for a new port, just off the coast where the shortest distance to the deep water is. And he outlined 2 routes marked in orange there, a south route and a Ness Valley route, either or both for getting freight into the major transport networks. The Port Future Study came along after Martin and looked at these 3 sites. And then most recently, and thankfully, the Auckland Business Chamber has come up with another option, which is a 4th site further south in the Thames, with an inland port. They talk about a sea platform with an inland port at perhaps south of Pocono and near Merrimeri, and a connection with a wider railed track than our normal tracks that would allow double stacking the containers. So a few extra ideas in there, and we're thankful that the Auckland Business Chamber have moved to a position of saying, let's make the right decision for New Zealand, let's get this right, and they're supporting a Thames option. If we look at the Manukau, there were 3 options in the ones in black that were presented by the Port Future Study on these 3 banks. And you can see that the Puanui option has this short connection into the road and rail infrastructure there, and that's part of the huge benefit that the Puanui option provides. We've just added 3 extra options here, which would provide, and worthy of study, connections to the south. And I'll speak to those in a minute. I think in the Thames options and all these options, you'd be bridging over the intertidal zones. And in speaking to this Manukau option for a moment, Richard's talked about the problems here. We have some dredging issues here, which in the middle of the harbour, which aren't world beating in terms of their size or their effects. And I think also another thing that's overlooked with doing this is no one would, I think, develop any of these port options without not only mitigating the effects of building a new port, but also looking at what other major improvements could occur. But to speak more generally rather than to those specific sites, the advantage of these that we've talked about today, the short road connections for imports to what I call the current freight bowl of Auckland, and also to this blue area to the south, which has just this huge capacity of growth, which is all in the centre, if you like, of with a weighting towards the centroid weighted towards Auckland, of the Auckland, Tauranga and Hamilton triangle. There's efficient road and rail exports from the Waikato and further south to a port in the Manukau without those connections going into, those trains going further into Auckland City. There's a better shipping connections, as Mick has told us, in terms of origins and destinations to southern New Zealand ports. The Manukau port, or any new large megaport, can cater for all types of trade, can adopt new technologies. There was a lot of excitement talking about the Northport report, in the Northport report, about electrification of trains and so forth, and all those new things can be done in either of the other locations as well. And of course, we'll have the space to grow here without restriction, and that's an important point. But the manufacturing, the Manukau offers the manufacturing, warehousing and distribution businesses of Auckland a way to grow without disrupting their current supply chains. And the friction between big freight and rapid transit is reduced. So what's the next step? Just to finish up, I sort of looked for this in an answer to the question. I went back to an August 1989 report 31 years ago, produced by Ports of Auckland, the ARC and Auckland City Council. And it identified the site with the best facilities for the future of Auckland, and that was at Puanui. It has marked advantages of proximity to major road and rail services. And doesn't it look like something that it could have been dragged forward? We did this 31 years ago in Courier 10 IBM golf ball font, identified this area as the one that was for the future of Auckland. And it recognised too, as with all ports, that there'll be ecological, environmental and cultural issues, but there would be large economic benefits, and that tangata whenua needed to be consulted and share in those discussions. So that was 31 years ago. We're sitting in the same place now. And that report said that the next step to stop wasting money before you did anything more, the next step should be to determine the practicability of providing a suitable entrance and approach channel within the next 2 years. So that would have been done in 1991 had it been acted upon, but the report was buried. So I've had to go back into the future to find the answer, and I've gone back there not to save Doc Brown, or not to make sure my parents got married, but rather to find out what our best next step is, which is to get on with doing the entrance study. It's a small investment for a potentially huge economic return. It'll give us more facts at hand, which will help us provide better cost estimates of the Manukau Harbour option. The Manukau option provides the best supply chain solution, but the entrance study will either red flag it or green flag it. If it green flags it, then we open the door to huge economic gains for New Zealand against the other options. If we red flag it, then we look at the other options. So the question, if we move the port, it would seem that the speakers tonight don't need to answer that question, because the Port Future Study, the Superior, the Auckland Business Chamber and Government have already really, there's an increasing number of reports and people who are saying, yes, we do recognise we need to shift it. The data that Mark mentioned, the population, the GDP per capita import consumption data point to a growth which says we'll need it. Manukau is the first choice economically, and in the Port Future Study, it also ranked first under a really broad and detailed multi-criteria analysis. So when would we do it? When freight volumes can't be catered for in the CBD, that's in the port, that's one time we'll do it. We might do it when other economic, social or cultural or city building or New Zealand Inc. building reasons prevail. And the point here is it's not just when the port can't handle the freight. There are other good reasons why a trigger might be pulled. And one of those might be that we just want to cater for more freight types in Auckland. So we want to get bulk liquids back into Auckland and scale or petroleum. So there's 3 good reasons for getting on and deciding when. But the key there, timing is not determined by the ports of Auckland, freight capacity. We should avoid over-investing in the current port, certainly invest in it to take us through a period of change. And I think it's important for us to be looking at land-based freight transport now, because it'll get more difficult and more costly and possibly get closed out if we don't plan and designate now. And I've just, in the top right-hand corner there, we all know that there's a major piece of planning work going on, developing the rail network through South Auckland and connections through to Pukekohe. And I don't think pieces of work like this can progress in a vacuum without at least understanding that the Manukau could be a realistic option. So I'll end as I began. Do we love it or list it? We're not deciding this week, Kirsty and Phil, but we should get on with the next step. And that's the practicability of providing a suitable Manukau entrance approach channel. And we should make that decision, have that work completed in the next 2 years. It's a logical thing to do for the economic gains that are available. And I'll just throw and bounce 2 ideas across at the same time. Hopefully we'll all understand or develop a shared understanding about the trigger and the timing of options, and it not being just the port. Superior have already noted that bringing the Manukau option forward increases the net present value or the worth of the Manukau option itself, and we should be all the planners involved in Auckland land and transport planning now should be cognizant of where these two possible new ports could be in Auckland, the leading option in the Manukau and the other one in the Firth, and all transport planners should be taking note of that now. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Rob, and we're open for questions.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to our 4 speakers here. Just a note that this entire webinar is being recorded and will be made available within the next 48 hours on the CILT New Zealand's YouTube channel. Also, the slides from each of the speakers tonight will be made available on the CILT website within the next 48 hours. So we've had some questions come in so far, and I'd like to just put a couple up there of what's come in. There's several questions that were asked similarly, so I'll do what I suggested I would do before, and that's actually ask one question that covers all of them. So first off, and I'll just come to my list here, so just bear with me so I can find them. So this is a question, I think, basically sort of directed to Mark to begin with. Has the economic assessment that you described, Mark, included a review of the sea route cost for all ports or just for the Manukau?
Well, it's only a West Coast port that gets the advantage of these shorter sea routes, because anything that goes down the East Coast, the ships have to traverse from North Cape to wherever the southernmost port is, probably Port Chalmers. What the previous studies have done have all just assumed that the sea route costs are the same in all cases. No difference, therefore no need to investigate them. But it's not really the case. So any route that would end up with shorter sea distances should be, the difference should be taken into account. And that's what I've done with the West Coast option.
Okay, further to that, there's a question also come in. As you know, New Zealand West Coast ports can often be affected by weather resulting in periodic port closure. What impact do you believe it would have on importers and exporters if, let's say, a West Coast port, Manukau in this instance, was closed long enough that the vessels weren't able to get in and out? Would someone, one or more of you, like to comment on that?
Well, shall I comment initially? Richard might have something to say as well. Richard drew a comparison with San Francisco, and the wave regime off San Francisco is somewhat similar in terms of wave height and wave period probabilities. Yet that port is one of the top 6 US container ports. It has 1,500 arrivals a year, and that makes it not quite as big as Los Angeles, Long Beach, or Savannah, or New York, but it's still of that size. They probably have days when they don't bring ships in and out. I'm not sure about the statistics on that, but it hasn't caused them problems. I think the same sort of thing applies to Botany Bay and Melbourne. They have closures from time to time. They're more benign wave regions than the Manukau, but
so Mark,
yeah.
if I can follow up, I think that's exactly the kind of study or evaluation that needs to be carried out. So in terms of persistency, looking at the climate and the operability of both getting into and out of the harbour is something that there isn't enough information now to answer that question, but it's something, as Greg pointed out, is that either red flag or green flag, the persistency study, the ship navigation, the modifications and the ability to maintain a harbour entrance are the things that need to be understood before we make too much more progress with doing more land-based thinking. And I guess from my perspective, I would be saying consider both at a study stage, Firth of Thames and the Manukau, rather than choosing one or the other, because both have some benefits, both have some risks. For a more detailed study at both options, I think that would be my recommendation rather than choosing one.
Thanks, Richard. Another question has come in. Did the Sapere report consider a deep water port anywhere else in the Hauraki Gulf or even at Port Waikato?
No, they did go back through the port future study, and BlackRock had quite a large range of possible locations. I think the last time I saw the deep water Hauraki proposal was some early reports in the 1990s, and maybe by Becker. So it hasn't been carried much further than some very high level thinking in the 90s. In terms of Port Waikato and sort of further south, the challenges of a much more shallower bar and the Waikato River create some additional complexities at that location. So would also be a challenging environment. So I guess I would suggest that if it's feasible in the Waikato, in the Manukau, that would be a more favourable location than the Port Waikato option.
Rob, if I could just add there, the Port Future Study was very thorough in terms of considering all the options, including ones further south on the west coast, more further north on the west coast, and south and north on the east coast. So there would have been over 15 or 20 options and sub-options considered before it was narrowed down to a group of 6, and then eventually a group of 2, which was the Manukau and Thames. So it was a very thorough study done in 2016.
Thanks, Greg. Another question has come in. I think this is one for Richard and some of the other speakers to answer in turn. What are the coastal processes, benefits and risk of a port in the Firth of Thames in comparison to the Manukau option?
Sure, and yes, I'm sorry, I did cover that quite briefly. Part of the reason is that there are less issues. So we've got within the Hauraki Gulf a lower wave climate. So if you recall, it was sort of an average wave height of, a mean wave height of 2.1 on the west coast. We're talking about something within the Hauraki Gulf that's in the order of 0.5 metre. It's just a more sheltered environment. We've got a rocky coast. What that means is it's quite steep and goes to deep water quite quickly. So engineering works to build a port to get to deep water is easier. And as a rock coast, you don't have the same movement of sand running up along the coast. So littoral processes, you've got more headland bays and embayed areas of sand with rock coast headlands. So coastal process-wise, it's a more smaller scale set of issues to consider. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. And a much narrower dredge channel, or sorry, a shorter dredge channel because of that deep water. So in terms of coastal processes and effects, a more localized scale.
Thank you. Another question has come in. What about large ships sailing from to the USA or other Pacific nations? Would there be an issue in them having to go to a West Coast port as opposed to a port on the East Coast in Auckland?
Well, I don't suppose that the Port of Tauranga would close, and it's an excellent East Coast port. So for services which would benefit from calling it an East Coast rather than a West Coast port, that really is the main option.
Right, now I must admit I've got a question of my own which I'd like to ask, if that's all right. I'm interested to know, is there actually any insurance risk at all in moving cargo in and out of a major port that's situated in the Manukau? Is that perceived rather than an actual issue?
Again, that is a good thing, a good question, and something that I don't think has been fully investigated, but it would be something that, as a result of a harbour entrance study, understandings on persistency and risk would provide some information for insurers and to have a more informed view. At the moment, there just isn't that information to have an informed view.
Also, a question for you probably, Richard, and maybe for Greg as well. Has climate change and sea level rise been factored into any of the studies?
No. It's certainly something that would need to be considered and would be for any study. So it's complicated within harbours and inlets on how they perform. Obviously, deeper water with sea level rise maybe creates some benefits of not having to dredge so deep. Changes in wave climate and littoral drift would also need to be understood as well.
Thank you. I'm just going through to see if there are any other questions that haven't already been asked. I think we've pretty well covered it.
I guess one of the things with climate change, and if you think about the zero carbon bill, having a shorter transport route and a saving in fuel has a net benefit. So whilst none of the options have been looked at in terms of carbon or efficiency, reducing fuel has a benefit in terms of the zero carbon bill. So there is a climate change benefit with having shorter routes and quicker access on road to market.
Okay, a couple of other questions have come in. If the port is moved, as you say, it's not a matter of if, but when the port is moved to another location, would the actual current location of Auckland Port still be operable, or would it actually shut down?
Sounds like a great question.
Well, I think we could start answering that question by talking about how you would transition between two ports in Auckland, whether that new port is in Thames or the Manukau. And you may, for instance, start that process by moving bulk cargoes and cars first and cranes later. I think that while cruise operations could be expanded and other maritime activities expanded on Waitemata in the cruise industry, but there are two distinct operations, aren't there, in the port at the moment. There's the multi-cargo and cars on the Bledisloe Wharf, and there's the containers on the Ferguson Wharf, and I think the case for moving all of it is what has been considered and provides the economic benefit so far. And I would see myself little opportunity to leave a rump of cargo operations behind, but would have no problem that being considered in a future study.
Sorry, I saw Rick put a question on the hinterland and the transport routes and the road access from any future port area or from the Manukau. I think that's I guess one of the key takeaways, and it comes from Greg's comments too, is wanting to preserve the ability to achieve a port and the access in the future means that thinking about and designating space for the hinterland access is really important, and that's why that needs to be done sooner rather than later, irrespective of when the port actually moves. Securing the route access from the hinterland is pretty crucial.
Okay, got another question here. Would a Manukau port be perceived as being more of a commercial threat to the port of Tauranga?
Yes, this is a good thing, isn't it? Because competition results in efficiencies, and efficiencies results in reduction in costs. So it's imperative, wherever we have a port, that there's competition. The way that competition is provided in most places, most countries, is to have several concessions issued to the terminals within the port so that the terminal operators compete one with the other. In New Zealand, we're lucky in that we've got two large ports relatively close to each other, only 200 kilometres apart. So we've got competition at the moment between ports of Auckland and Port of Tauranga, and it's resulted in two extremely efficient ports. And this would need to continue either through concessions in a single port or through having two ports competing one with the other.
So, Mark, following on from that, if you look at New Zealand Inc. in totality, Should we actually be looking at the entire North Island to consolidate all our ports in the North Island into one or two to get the best supply chain efficiencies for importers and exporters?
We have to be careful about that. The reason for a lot of the benefits of a West Coast port are to do with reducing the sea distances. And sea transportation is an order of magnitude cheaper per ton kilometre than any land transportation. So so that really you want to take the cargo as far as you possibly can by sea, and then do short land transport. Of course, there's an optimal solution there. You can take it too far to an extreme, but no, I wouldn't see, for example, Napier and Wellington disappearing as container ports.
So also, this is a question to Greg. The questioner wants to clarify here. Obviously, as you say, there's significant economic activity to siting a port in Manukau around Puinui, for example. And I presume that in this case, the proximity to Auckland Airport and the modal choice that provides for the future would certainly make it an attractive option, air and sea in the same area. Is that the value of Manukau in this regard?
The value in Manukau is the short distances for imports to travel to get to the warehouses and distribution centres where the containers are unpacked. It's just a few kilometres, and that there's growth in that area further south. The airport and the co-location of that somewhere in the near area is useful, because there'll be some people in the logistics supply chain in the industry that would advantage from both of those. But I mean, they are two distinct different cargoes, but there are businesses that handle both. But it is not the central part of the economic argument, that co-location. It's a useful smaller advantage. I think the main advantage is the distances, and it may be that that when we get into a close analysis of the land transport options, there might be a need to separate out some of the land transport that's associated with the airport with land transport that would be associated with a growing port. If we thought 30 or 40 years ahead, because we wouldn't want congestion between those two, either on State Highway 20, for instance. I mean, I think the land transport infrastructure is going to be more significant and much more than it is now.
And a follow-up question to that, and this is for both you, Greg, and for Richard, I believe. With climate change, is the low land height in the Puinui area, for example, if a port was to be situated there, does that pose a long-term risk for the port?
So I think at that particular location, you do have reasonable bluffs and Tauranga group material, sort of 5 to 8 meters high at least. So that's not one of the lower lying areas of the Manukau. Certainly around the airport and that area tends to be a little bit lower, but actually as you move south towards Puinui, you have a different, more bluff cliff edge kind of geology. So not a bad place for moderating effects of sea level rise.
Now here's a question for Mick, actually two in fact. Mick, you spoke about the vessels in approximately 10,000 TEU no longer being built. Now, this kind of ship size will gradually be phased out, if I understand this correctly, and the questioner asks the same. Ships of this size are the limits of the port of Tauranga and Auckland, respectively. So what else might happen in this regard if it was to be sited on the West Coast? Is this a factor at all, or does the location not matter in this case?
Well, I think there's going to be a number of different solutions come through. You never get one. We've talked about the big ships coming in. They're going to be the predominant services. It might be one service of big ships from each of those three combinations I spoke about earlier. But there will be other services, and possibly they will be used for relaying. So you might have one big vessel come through for service A. It has two medium-sized vessels services that come through Manukau and head south still, and are used for relaying the other bigger vessels cargo to the south. Some of the cargo to the south will go on coastal services that are captive to the New Zealand coast. There may even be the services that are going trans-Tasman, captive within that ring, that are doing the smaller ports as well. So there's going to be a combination of each. There's not one solution fits all. But what we're seeing is that trend. And interestingly, in Melbourne, I caught up with people the other day that telling me that this latest COVID-19 situation that's occurred to us all has complicated cargo flows and obviously some reduction in freight movement because of access to importers. And as a consequence, some of the lines have cut out sailings and put in larger vessels. Those larger vessels are now going into the ICTL in Webb Dock, can't get up to Swanson. So you start having these sorts of complications. I can see there's going to be a combination of these sorts of things. Trade flows will change, the availability of ships will change. Reefer capacity is another issue that we haven't really discussed, but it's certainly important in terms of finding vessels for the future that will be able to carry the amount of refrigerated space that we need. So we need combinations. It won't be a total huge ships only and nothing else, but that's where it's heading. And unless you underpin the services with those bigger cascaded ships that have been pushed out of the east-west trades and are perhaps running at 12, 13,000 TEU and squeeze some of them into these trades, we're not going to keep our average costs down and not going to have the service levels that we've had hitherto. So, there's not one answer, and there will be a combination of things evolving, as there are in New Zealand at the moment. I've had services that have changed with ports of call cut out and caused quite a lot of complications. Just simply ships are getting too big and they have to start changing their rotations accordingly.
Just a follow-on question to that. I think this would be directed to you, Mick, as well as to you, Mark. Initially, what opportunities, for example, would a hub port, as you described, Mick, at Manukau, bring for other ports along the west coast, such as New Plymouth, which would now be on a shipping route?
Well, yes, obviously that does increase the probability of being able to call in New Plymouth. Or no, it's all a matter of how big the ship is, and as I say, some of the smaller range of vessels that are still used might well be used in terms of feeding down the coast. I mean, you might find the Papua New Guinea southbounders would come through there and then head south and be used not only for or just for coastal movements to go down to the South Island via a number of ports. These things will all evolve in time, and they're changing. You've only got to look and see how many the changes that have occurred in the last 3 years to realise that it's going to change many times before we even get to see the solution. We've just got to provide ports that can cope with that range, and you certainly need more than one in the Upper North Island, and you'll still need small ports in the rest of the country, and maybe a few that can still handle ships that are a little bigger than they are now.
Other questions come in here. If we're looking at long-term growth plans, and I think, Greg, you could probably best answer this to begin with. If we're looking at long-term growth plans, zoning, development, etc., how does this tie in with the transport routes and the proposed port locations? You made mention of this. I'm interested to get a bit more detail on this from you.
It's absolutely vital. It ties in today, really, and it's why, because the port may be able to satisfy a freight demand for the next 15 years, 20 years. The problem is much more immediate than that. What we need to do is cater for the potential for a new port in either Manukau or the Firth of Thames, and we have to preserve the land or the designations for the favoured option. And that has to be done now before it's built out. And so the planners, for instance, who are planning new motorways to around the airport, or new upgrades around the airport, and highways to Pukekohe and so forth, need to be aware of, because that's a 30-year plan, need to be aware of those sorts of investments, and there'll be others. and is why it is vital for us to, if the answer to the question if is yes, no, we do need to develop a new port, and Manukau or Thames is going to be an option, it needs a land designation, and that needs to be done now before it's built out, full stop.
Another question which has come in, and this is as much as all of the speakers can answer. If you look across the three studies, the Sapere report, you know, the port future studies, and the Upper North Island study, was there anything looked at in terms of the fact that, for example, at the moment, you are quite often having trucks running across New Zealand that are empty one way and full the other, like same with trains. Was this taken into account, the fact that from a New Zealand Inc. point of view, the emphasis must be to really reduce the costs in the supply chain overall and increase utilization across all the modes? Did the studies cover that aspect?
Yes, Mickey, I'm pretty sure that if they probably didn't, but it is a very important issue, because traditionally, if cargo has been imported and is distributed from Auckland to the Upper North Island, south of Auckland, shall we say, then those same trucks were bringing exports back into the Auckland hub there, or to Tauranga, and then again cargo coming from Tauranga across. It was all nicely balanced. If you end up with a say the Thames solution, perhaps that won't be quite so balanced and will create some deadheading of trucks going back from the Thames up to Auckland again to come south out of Auckland with cargo to get them back near the cargo sources. So I see that as perhaps something we haven't mentioned before. I would doubt it was in the studies.
Thank you. One final question here, then I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. I understand this is one of the questions that's come in. There's a regulation out there called IMO 2020. Are you as speakers familiar with this particular regulation? And if so, what is its impact, do you believe, on the port relocation? Is it perceived rather than actual?
I'm not quite sure what the IMO 2020 is a reference to, but IMO promulgated on the 1st of January this year that we have low sulfur fuels. If it's referring to that, well, it wouldn't have any, the choice of any of these ports wouldn't have any particular impact. They would still have to have low sulfur fuels. But maybe it's something else, some other IMO initiative.
I think we'll have to actually dig into that one a little further at some stage, and it might even be the subject for a follow-on port move webinar, perhaps. Well, thank you. That seems to finish all the questions tonight. And on behalf of all the participants, I'd like to thank Mick, Mark, Richard and Greg for devoting their time to this port webinar. And I'd like to thank you all as participants for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us tonight. Just to reiterate, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the CILT NZ YouTube channel before the end of the week. So please don't hesitate to connect across there if you came in halfway, or you'd like to have others have a look at this webinar who weren't able to join us tonight. Please visit our YouTube channel. Also, the slides from all the speakers will be made available on the CILT website by the end of the week. And as Ronnie Barker would say, it's a good night from me and it's good night from him. So thank you very much to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And thank you very much once again to Greg, Mark, Mick and Richard for what has been a very interesting webinar. Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good night.